Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on one of those dreary, mist-laden mornings in November when I found myself once again in the familiar surroundings of 221B Baker Street. The fire in our sitting room crackled, sending flickering shadows across the walls as Holmes sat in his habitual position. Legs stretched out before him, fingers steepled, eyes half closed in that curious state of repose that to the untrained observer might appear as indolence, but which I had come to recognize as intense concentration. London lay shrouded in a heavy fog, curling around the gas lamps and muffling the distant sounds of hooves upon cobblestone. I had just set down my teacup when the sharp rattle of the doorbell pierced the morning's quietude. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread echoed down the hall, followed by the faint murmur of conversation, and moments later the door swung open to reveal a man of distinguished bearing. He was a gentleman of advancing years, dressed in a fine yet somewhat dishevelled morning coat, his features lined with the unmistakable mark of deep concern. His sharp, grey eyes, though weary, held a certain nobility of spirit, and as he removed his hat, I noted the faint tremor in his hands. Holmes, without opening his eyes, spoke at once. "Pray be seated, Lord Ashworth," he said. "You have had a troubled night, and if I am not mistaken, you have come regarding a matter of some urgency, perhaps a theft, though not of ordinary nature." The visitor started visibly. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes, how could you possibly—" Holmes waved his hand dismissively. "Your coat sleeve bears traces of Egyptian dust. But come, sir, let us have the details." Lord Percival Ashworth sank into the chair opposite Holmes, his breath still uneven from what I presume to be both agitation and the exertion of climbing our 17 steps. He clasped his hands together as if collecting himself before he began. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes," he said gravely. "It is indeed a theft that brings me here, and a most perplexing one at that. A most irreplaceable artifact has vanished from Ashworth Manor. An ancient golden mask of the pharaoh Horemheb, passed down through my family for generations. And yet, it has disappeared from a locked display case in a room that was locked from within." I felt a surge of curiosity at this pronouncement, while Holmes merely regarded him with that piercing gaze of his fingers tapping lightly upon the armrest of his chair. "You say the room was locked from the inside?" Holmes asked. "Precisely, and only 3 individuals aside from myself had access. My butler, Mr. Grayson, a most trusted servant of 30 years, Professor Langley, a noted historian who has been studying the artifact, and my niece Eleanor, who has recently returned from Cairo. None of them could have taken it. And yet, Mr. Holmes, the mask is gone." Holmes exhaled softly, his eyes glinting with interest. "A fascinating conundrum. And tell me, Lord Ashworth, has any attempt been made to recover it?" "None that have borne fruit. I fear that if it is not found soon, scandal shall follow. I had promised to donate the artifact to the British Museum, and should word of its disappearance leak out—" He paused, his face clouded. "Mr. Holmes, I implore you, will you take the case?" Holmes leaned forward, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. "My dear Lord Ashworth, how could I resist?" He sprang from his chair, his keen energy now fully engaged. "Come, Watson, It appears we have before us a most singular mystery. We leave for Ashworth Manor at once." Lord Percival Ashworth exhaled deeply, his gloved hands clasping the arms of his chair. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "the theft occurred under circumstances that defy all logic. The golden mask was displayed in a locked glass case within my private gallery at Ashworth Manor. The room itself was secured, the windows bolted, and the only key, aside from the one in my possession, was entrusted to my butler, Mr. Grayson." Holmes rested his fingers together, eyes half closed in apparent indifference. "When was the artifact last seen?" "The night before last," Ashworth replied. "Professor Langley, an esteemed historian who has been cataloguing my collection, was the last to examine it. He assured me all was well before he departed. Yesterday morning, I entered the gallery to find the case undisturbed, yet the mask was gone." Holmes's eyes flickered open. "And there were no signs of forced entry?" "None." "No tampered locks?" "Not a single scratch." "Curious," murmured Holmes. He rose, moving toward the window. "The gallery. Does it contain any concealed passages?" "None that I am aware of," Ashworth said. "It is a most perplexing affair, Mr. Holmes. The mask has vanished, and yet there exists no conceivable means by which it could have been removed." Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. "Every crime has a method, Lord Ashworth. It is simply a matter of uncovering it." I watched as Holmes tapped his fingers rhythmically upon the mantelpiece, his mind no doubt already dissecting the elements of the case. "Tell me," he said suddenly, "aside from yourself and Mr. Grayson, who else had access to the gallery?" "Only two others," Ashworth admitted reluctantly. "Professor Langley, as I mentioned, and my niece, Eleanor." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "Interesting." He reached for his coat. "Watson, I believe our morning has suddenly become rather more engaging." Holmes leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed upon Ashworth. "Describe the layout of the gallery." Ashworth hesitated, then nodded. "It is a long rectangular room, lined with display cases. The mask was housed at the far end nearest the fireplace. There are no adjoining rooms, only a single entrance, which remains locked each night." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "And the key?" Ashworth withdrew a brass key from his waistcoat. "It has not left my possession." Holmes accepted it, inspecting the grooves. "And Mr. Grayson's copy?" "The butler keeps his secured in the house safe," Ashworth said. "I checked. It was undisturbed." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we must consider the possibility that the mask was not taken in the manner one would expect." I frowned. "Holmes, surely you do not mean—" "Precisely, Watson," he interrupted. "We must entertain the notion that the mask was not removed from the case at all, but that it vanished by an entirely different means." I could only shake my head at his cryptic statement, while Ashworth regarded him with growing unease. Holmes pocketed the key. "Lord Ashworth, I trust you have no objections to Watson and myself conducting a thorough investigation." "None at all, Mr. Holmes. I shall do whatever is necessary to recover my family's treasure." Ashworth sighed, rubbing his temples. "You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that this theft could have dire consequences. The golden mask was to be donated to the British Museum in a fortnight. Should word of its disappearance reach the public, I will be ruined. My integrity, my very name, will be called into question." Holmes studied him for a long moment. "You fear accusations of fraud?" Ashworth hesitated. "I fear that whispers may spread, suggesting I stage the theft for my own gain. My collection is vast. but even I cannot claim to be impervious to financial strain. Holmes nodded. Yes, the disappearance of a priceless artifact under impossible circumstances would indeed raise suspicion. He turned to me. Watson, take note. The matter is not merely one of theft, but of reputation. That alters the stakes considerably. I glanced at Ashworth, who sat with his hands clenched. There was no mistaking the strain upon his features. You will help me? He asked. Holmes reached for his hat. My dear Lord Ashworth, you may consider the matter already in progress. As we descended the stairs of Baker Street, I could not help but study Holmes's expression. He was in that peculiar state of heightened focus, his mind already racing ahead. Well, Holmes, I ventured. He smiled faintly. A locked room, an impossible theft, and a family heirloom of immense value. Tell me, Watson, do you not find it exhilarating? I find it confounding, I admitted. He chuckled. Precisely as it should be. But let us not draw conclusions prematurely. There are details yet to be examined, details which I suspect will prove most illuminating. We arrived at the station in due course, securing tickets for the early afternoon train to Surrey. The rhythmic churning of the engine filled the air as Holmes sat opposite me, his fingers steepled in thought. I observed him in silence, knowing better than to interrupt, when he was engaged in deep contemplation. Outside, the mist-shrouded countryside passed in a blur, the autumnal chill seeping through the carriage window. At last, Holmes spoke. A golden mask, Watson, a symbol of kingship and deception. I wonder, will this case prove to be a matter of clever illusion or of something far more sinister? The journey to Surrey was marked by Holmes's customary silence. He sat opposite me in the train carriage, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed upon the grey landscape beyond the window. I had travelled with him enough to recognise the intensity of his thought, and so I left him undisturbed. Only as the train slowed at our station did he stir, his eyes flashing with renewed energy. Ashworth Manor was a formidable structure, its stone facade darkened by the dampness of the morning fog. Lord Percival Ashworth awaited us at the entrance, his usual dignity somewhat dimmed by the weight of his troubles. You have my gratitude for coming, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said gravely. I trust you had a pleasant journey. Holmes inclined his head. The mind, when sufficiently occupied, renders all journeys pleasant, my lord. His sharp eyes flickered over the grand entrance before returning to our host. To business, then. You will take us to the scene of the theft? Without delay, Ashworth led us through the manor's dimly lit corridors, the air thick with an air of antiquity. At last, we arrived at a heavy oak door, beyond which lay his private gallery. The mask was taken from within, Ashworth murmured as he turned the key. But as you will see, Mr. Holmes, there is no conceivable means by which it could have been removed. Holmes's lips curved slightly. No conceivable means, Lord Ashworth. Let us not be too hasty in our conclusions. With that, he stepped inside, his keen eyes already scanning the room with the intensity of a predator scenting its prey. The gallery was long and narrow, its walls adorned with relics and artifacts from distant lands. At the far end stood an ornate display case, its glass unbroken, its contents, save for the missing mask, undisturbed. Holmes moved with swift precision, his gaze darting from one detail to the next. He circled the display case, tapping lightly against the glass before turning his attention to the door. Locked from the inside, you say? He inquired. Ashworth nodded. As it is every night. I inspected it myself the morning the mask was found missing. There was no sign of forced entry. Holmes crouched, running a finger along the threshold. He then turned his attention to the windows, secured with iron latches, and to the towering bookshelves that lined the room. With a thoughtful hum, he moved toward the fireplace, tracing the edges of the stone mantel with his fingertips. "Watson, do you observe?" he asked suddenly. I stepped forward, glancing between him and the empty display. "I confess, Holmes, I see nothing out of the ordinary." "Precisely," he murmured. "And yet, a thing may be too ordinary, may it not? Consider, this is not an instance of common burglary. A thief enters to steal, yet here there was no entry. A case is broken to remove its contents, yet here the glass remains whole. We are left then with a singular fact. The mask is missing, and yet, by all appearances, it was never taken at all." Ashworth's face darkened. "What are you suggesting, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew his magnifying glass, lowering it toward the display case. After a moment, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "I am suggesting, Lord Ashworth, that our mystery is not one of theft alone, but of illusion." Ashworth exhaled heavily. "There are only 3 individuals aside from myself who had access to this room." Holmes motioned for him to continue. "Mr. Grayson, my butler, has been with my family for 30 years. He is a man of unwavering loyalty." Holmes's gaze flickered. "Loyalty is an admirable trait, but it does not preclude necessity, my lord, and the others." Professor Langley, a historian, was entrusted with cataloguing my collection. He was the last to examine the mask before its disappearance. Indeed, and his disposition. A scholar through and through, meticulous in his work, if somewhat withdrawn. Holmes turned to the last name. "And Miss Eleanor Ashworth?" Ashworth hesitated. "My niece has recently returned from Egypt. She has long been fascinated by antiquities, though she insists she has no interest in the mask itself." Holmes smiled faintly. "Fascinating. Watson, I do believe we shall find our visit most illuminating." He turned back to Ashworth. "I shall require a conversation with each of these individuals, my lord. Let us begin, if you please." Holmes moved with deliberate precision about the gallery, his gaze sweeping over every surface, every angle, his fingers trailing lightly along the edges of the display case. Suddenly, he paused, crouching near the pedestal where the golden mask had once rested. "Ah," he murmured, his fingers brushing against the wooden base. He raised them to the light, revealing a faint shimmer upon his fingertips. "Watson, do you observe?" I stepped forward, peering down at the scarcely perceptible dust upon the surface. "Gold." Holmes nodded. "Gold dust, so fine as to be nearly invisible to the untrained eye. And yet, here it lies, proof that the mask was disturbed in a manner not yet accounted for." Lord Ashworth furrowed his brow. "But Mr. Holmes, surely if the thief removed the mask, such dust would be expected." "Quite so, my lord," Holmes said smoothly. "And yet there is an inconsistency. Had the mask been lifted from its place, we would expect to find disturbances elsewhere, perhaps on the floor, upon the case itself. Instead, the dust is isolated, confined to a single area. That tells us something, does it not?" I pondered this before shaking my head. "I fail to see it, Holmes." He smiled. "It tells us, Watson, that the mask was not simply lifted and carried away in haste. No, this was done with great care, precision, almost as if—" He trailed off, eyes glinting with that familiar spark of anticipation. "Almost as if what, Mr. Holmes?" Lord Ashworth asked impatiently. Holmes only dusted off his hands and turned his attention to the great mahogany desk in the corner of the room. "Let us reserve our conclusions, my lord, until all the facts present themselves. There is something here that intrigues me still." Holmes approached the desk with interest, his fingers grazing the surface as he took in its contents. Scattered papers, an inkpot, and a series of neatly arranged books lay upon it. But his attention was drawn to a single object at its centre, a candle half burned, its wax pooling at the base. "Curious," he murmured, reaching down to lift it. He turned it in his hands, examining the wick with keen scrutiny. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked. He did not answer immediately, but instead pinched the wick lightly between his fingers. A faint residue clung to them, glinting under the lamplight. "Watson, have you ever known a candle to produce a metallic residue?" I frowned. "No, certainly not." Holmes set the candle down with a faint smile. "Then I should think we have found something of interest." Professor Langley, who had remained silent thus far, stepped forward with a look of bemusement. "That is merely a candle, Mr. Holmes. I fail to see its significance." Holmes glanced up at him. "Then perhaps you might enlighten me, Professor. Why would an ordinary candle contain traces of gold?" Langley blinked, his expression unreadable. "Gold? Indeed." "And yet, here it is," Holmes said, tapping the candle gently. "A most singular detail, is it not?" He turned away, seemingly satisfied with his discovery, but I could see the wheels of deduction turning within his mind. Holmes had seen something vital. And yet, as was often the case, he chose to keep his conclusions to himself, at least for the moment. As Holmes turned his attention elsewhere, my own gaze wandered across the room, settling upon the heavy, ornate tapestries that adorn the walls. They were of deep crimson and gold, depicting scenes of antiquity, Egyptian pharaohs, desert landscapes, hieroglyphs woven into the fabric with exquisite detail. "Holmes," I called, gesturing toward them. "These are quite remarkable." Holmes glanced over, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, Watson, remarkable indeed." Lord Ashworth followed our gaze. "They were acquired many years ago, gifts from an old acquaintance in Cairo. Aesthetically pleasing, certainly, but they are little more than decoration." Holmes stepped forward, reaching out to press against the tapestry's surface. It yielded slightly under his touch. "And yet," he mused, "decoration often serves a purpose beyond the obvious." Before Ashworth could reply, Holmes grasped the edge of one tapestry and pulled it back slightly, revealing the smooth, unblemished wall behind it. He let it fall back into place and turned away, seemingly uninterested. "What did you expect to find, Holmes?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Nothing, my dear Watson, at least, not yet." His answer left me puzzled, but I knew better than to press further. Holmes never acted without reason, and though his observations often seemed disconnected at first, I had no doubt they would soon converge into something unmistakably clear. And so, I merely nodded, making a silent note of his interest in the tapestries, as well as the subtle tension that flickered across Lord Ashworth's face at the mention of their origin. Holmes had seated himself at Lord Ashworth's desk, his fingers tapping idly upon the wooden surface. His eyes, however, were anything but idle, darting from object to object, as if absorbing every minute detail. "There is one further matter, Lord Ashworth," he said suddenly. "You have mentioned the individuals with access to the gallery, yet you have not spoken of any recent visitors to the estate." Ashworth hesitated. "Well, there was one. A brief visit, hardly worth mentioning." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "I assure you, my lord, in matters of theft and deception, Even the most fleeting presence may hold significance. Ashworth sighed. A week ago, an old acquaintance of mine, Amir al-Farouk, paid a visit. He is an Egyptian dignitary, a scholar of antiquities, and was passing through London. Knowing of my collection, he wished to view the mask. Holmes's fingers ceased their tapping. Was he alone? He was accompanied by an aide, but spent little time in the gallery. I remained with him throughout his visit. Holmes glanced at me before returning his attention to Ashworth. And did he express any particular interest in the mask? Ashworth frowned. He did ask about its provenance, and I recall he mentioned that such artifacts belonged in their homeland. But I thought little of it. Such sentiments are common among scholars. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. Indeed, my lord. Sentiments can be quite common. Motives, however, are rather more singular. Holmes rose from the desk and turned toward the window, gazing out into the mist-shrouded grounds. Your niece, Lord Ashworth, Miss Eleanor. She has recently returned from Egypt, has she not? Ashworth stiffened. Yes, though I fail to see. Holmes turned back sharply. On the contrary, my lord, I believe her return is of great relevance. I would like to speak with her. Ashworth's reluctance was evident, but he inclined his head. Very well, I shall have her summoned. A few moments later, Miss Eleanor Ashworth entered. She was a woman of striking presence, her dark eyes carrying an intelligence that reminded me fleetingly of Holmes himself. There was no sign of nervousness in her demeanour, yet Holmes studied her with the quiet intensity of a predator assessing its prey. You are well travelled, Miss Ashworth, he asked. She met his gaze evenly. I have spent the past year in Egypt, assisting an excavation team. It was, until recently, my intention to remain there. Holmes nodded. And your interest in antiquities, does it extend to your uncle's collection? She smiled faintly. I admire history, Mr. Holmes, but I had little interest in the mask. It was a family relic, nothing more. Holmes tilted his head slightly. Curious. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, crossed her features. And why is that curious? Holmes's expression remained unreadable. Because indifference is seldom absolute, Miss Ashworth. It is often a veil, concealing that which we would rather not disclose. There was a silence between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. At last, Holmes turned away, apparently satisfied. That will be all, Miss Ashworth. You have been most helpful. She hesitated, then inclined her head. As she left the room, I could not help but feel that Holmes had uncovered something, though what I could not yet say. Holmes had been uncharacteristically silent as we followed Lord Ashworth through the dimly lit corridors of the manor. At last, we entered his study, a stately room lined with heavy tomes and fine oak furnishings. Ashworth motioned towards his desk, upon which lay a folded letter, its edges slightly crumpled, as though it had been handled with unease. This arrived a fortnight ago, Ashworth said, his voice low. It was left upon my writing desk, though how it came to be there I cannot say. No servant admitted to placing it. Holmes took up the letter with delicate precision, unfolding it carefully. I leaned in to read over his shoulder. The message, scrawled in dark ink upon heavy parchment, was brief, but chilling. The mask does not belong to you. Return it to its rightful land, or misfortune shall follow. There was no signature, no indication of origin, only the stark warning. Holmes ran his fingers lightly over the paper, then held it up to the lamplight. An unusual choice of material, he murmured. Parchment, not common stationery, ink thick and dark, perhaps from a reed pen rather than a conventional nib. Curious indeed. Ashworth cleared his throat. You believe it to be more than an idle threat. Holmes smiled faintly. Idle threats do not materialize upon locked desks without explanation, my lord. He turned the letter over, scanning the back before setting it down. You say no one saw it delivered? None, Ashworth confirmed. I discovered it myself upon returning from an engagement in town. Holmes tapped a finger against his lips. And yet, it was placed with deliberate intent. A warning, certainly, but also a test, to see how you might react. Ashworth frowned. You suspect a connection to the theft? Holmes met his gaze. I suspect, my lord, that you are not the only one who believes this artifact belongs elsewhere. Professor Langley was a man of lean frame and scholarly demeanour, his manner precise yet curiously restrained. When summoned to Ashworth's study, he entered with a measured step, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Holmes wasted no time. Professor, you were the last to examine the mask before its disappearance. I should like to know the extent of your observations. Langley inclined his head slightly. It was, as always, in its proper place when I concluded my notes that evening. I locked the gallery as I left. Holmes studied him. And what, precisely, was the subject of your notes? Langley hesitated. A fraction of a second, but enough for Holmes to notice. A catalogue of the artefact's detailing, Mr. Holmes. The engravings, the possible origins. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Possible origins? You mean to suggest there is doubt regarding its authenticity? Langley's jaw tightened. Not doubt, but interpretation. The mask is believed to be from the reign of Horemheb, yet certain stylistic elements suggest a more obscure lineage. Holmes leaned back. And did you voice this interpretation to Lord Ashworth? Langley's fingers twitched slightly behind his back. It was not relevant. Not relevant, Holmes echoed. An artifact whose true origins might differ from its known history, and you deemed it of no consequence? Langley's breath quickened. I am an academic, Mr. Holmes, not a speculator. Holmes's smile was razor-thin. Then permit me a final inquiry, Professor. If the mask's history is as definitive as you claim, why do you seem so very troubled by my questions? Langley's lips pressed into a thin line, but he offered no reply. Holmes, evidently satisfied, turned away, his gaze once more flickering toward the letter upon Ashworth's desk. Watson, he murmured, I believe we are being guided toward a very particular path. The question is, who wishes us to walk it? It was as we sat in Lord Ashworth's study later that evening, a fire crackling low in the hearth, that Mr. Grayson, the butler, made his hesitant revelation. He stood stiffly before us, his hands clasped behind his back, his face pale with unease. I have served this house for 30 years, Mr. Holmes, he said, his voice edged with quiet tension. Never have I been one to give in to fancy, nor do I believe in ghosts or ill omens. But I swear to you, sir, there is something unnatural about that gallery at night. Holmes, who had been reclining in his chair with half-lidded eyes, suddenly straightened. Unnatural? Grayson swallowed. I have heard sounds, sir. Strange noises when the house should be still. Describe them, Holmes commanded. The butler hesitated. Soft movements, as if someone were pacing, though I have found no one there. Once, a faint metallic scraping, and on another occasion the briefest whisper, so indistinct I could not say if it was real or merely the wind. Holmes glanced at me before turning back to Grayson. And when was the last of these occurrences? 2 nights ago, sir. The night before the mask disappeared. I felt a chill pass through me at his words. Holmes, however, merely steepled his fingers. And yet, despite these disturbances, nothing was ever found. "No, sir." Holmes tapped a thoughtful rhythm upon the armrest of his chair. "Then we must ask ourselves, Mr. Grayson, whether these sounds were made by one who wished to remain hidden, or by one who wished to be heard." Grayson looked perplexed. "Sir?" Holmes only smiled. "A mystery within a mystery. Tell me, my good fellow, have you discovered anything else of interest?" Grayson hesitated, then nodded slowly. "There was one other thing, sir. A satchel, left outside the stables. A strange thing, and abandoned in haste." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Now that, Watson, is something worth examining." Holmes wasted no time. Within minutes, we had donned our coats and followed Mr. Grayson into the cool night air. The ground was damp beneath our boots, the faint mist curling along the edges of the estate's grounds. "There," Grayson said, pointing toward a shadowed corner near the stable doors. "I found it early this morning." Holmes strode forward, crouching beside the object. It was a worn satchel of brown leather, its surface scuffed and damp from the elements. He lifted it carefully, turning it in his hands, before unlatching the buckle and peering inside. "Empty," he murmured. I felt a flicker of disappointment. Perhaps it belonged to a servant and was merely forgotten. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, this was left deliberately." He gestured to the ground. "Observe the disturbed earth. Whoever abandoned it did so hastily, but not before ensuring it was positioned in clear sight. It was meant to be found." "But why?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "A question with many answers. Was it planted to mislead, to draw attention from something else? Or was it, in fact, left by one who feared discovery and sought to rid themselves of incriminating evidence?" He rose, slinging the satchel over his shoulder. "Whatever the case, we shall know soon enough." Grayson cleared his throat. "There is one more thing, sir. When I found it, I checked the area for footprints. There were none." Holmes's brow lifted. "None?" "None at all, sir. As if whoever left it there simply vanished." I felt the hairs at my neck prickle at the eerie suggestion, but Holmes merely chuckled. "Vanished, Mr. Grayson? Or ensured that no trace remained?" His voice carried a note of amusement, but I could see in his eyes that his mind was already piecing together something unseen. "Come, Watson," he said, turning back toward the house. "Tonight, we keep watch." The house had long since fallen silent. Lord Ashworth had retired to his chambers, and even the servants had retreated for the night. Yet Holmes and I remained in the gallery, concealed in the deep shadows of the farthest corner, waiting. "Are you certain of this, Holmes?" I whispered. He gave a slight nod. "There is a pattern here, Watson. Something, someone, has been moving within this house at night. If we are patient, I believe we shall have our answer." Minutes passed, then an hour. The stillness was near absolute, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the corridor beyond. I had begun to wonder if our vigil would prove fruitless when a sound, soft, almost imperceptible, caught my ear. A footstep. I stiffened, my grip tightening upon my cane. Holmes beside me did not move. Another step followed, then another. The sound was light, deliberate. Someone was in the gallery. Holmes touched my arm in a silent signal to wait. The footsteps moved closer, pausing now and again as if their owner was listening. Then came a sound unlike the others, faint, metallic, scraping against stone. My breath caught. Holmes's hand twitched. He was about to spring from our hiding place when... Silence. The footsteps ceased. The gallery was empty once more. We waited, listening, but no further sound came. At last Holmes rose, his movements swift and soundless. He crossed the room, gliding through the darkness until he reached the display case where the mask had once rested. He paused, then turned sharply. "Watson," he murmured. "Light." I struck a match, the glow casting flickering illumination across the polished floor. Holmes knelt, his eyes fixed upon something beneath the pedestal, a single golden flake of wax. He lifted it with care, examining it under the dim light. Then he smiled, not his usual wry amusement, but something keen, edged with certainty. "We have them now, Watson," he said softly. "We have them now." Holmes held the golden flake of wax between his fingers, his gaze distant and unreadable. He turned it slowly, the light of my match catching upon its faint shimmer. "Well, Holmes," I whispered. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with an air of quiet satisfaction, he tucked the fragment into his pocket and straightened. "Come, Watson. Our night's vigil has borne fruit, but the time for explanations has not yet arrived." I followed him back toward our previous hiding place, my mind racing with speculation. Holmes had seen something, grasped some connection that I, despite my best efforts, had failed to perceive. Yet he offered no further enlightenment, and I knew better than to press him before he was ready. "You have a theory," I said at last. He smiled faintly. "A theory, Watson. No, I have something far better." "And that is?" "A certainty." I could not suppress my exasperation. "Then surely you might share it." "Patience, my dear fellow," he murmured. "Patience." Holmes lapsed into silence once more, his thoughts locked away behind that impenetrable mind of his. I was left only with my own restless musings, attempting in vain to untangle the threads he had already woven into a complete design. At last, as the first traces of dawn began to pale the horizon, Holmes rose with renewed energy. "The case is nearly at its end, Watson," he said. "One final move remains." He turned to me, his eyes alight with anticipation. "We must lay our trap." By the time the household had roused itself for the day, Holmes had already devised his plan. Over breakfast, he made his declaration. "My dear Lord Ashworth," he announced, "I am pleased to inform you that the case is all but solved." Ashworth started. "You have discovered the thief?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Let us say, rather, that the thief has been identified. But to bring matters to a proper conclusion, I require only one thing." "And that is?" Holmes smiled. "Time. I shall reveal the culprit tomorrow at noon." A murmur of surprise ran through the gathered household. Professor Langley's lips tightened. Eleanor Ashworth's brows lifted. Mr. Grayson exchanged an uneasy glance with his master. Holmes noted it all, his expression one of perfect composure. "In the meantime," he continued, "I trust that all shall go about their usual routines." Lord Ashworth hesitated. "And what of you, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's smile deepened. "Oh, I shall be watching, my lord. I shall be watching very closely indeed." The morning passed in a state of tense expectancy. Lord Ashworth, his usual composure wavering, paced the length of his study, pausing only to cast anxious glances toward Holmes, who sat calmly in an armchair, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. At last, unable to contain himself, Ashworth burst out, "Mr. Holmes, if you truly know the culprit, why delay the revelation? Why not act at once?" Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Lord Ashworth, justice is most effective when it is complete. To apprehend a thief is one matter. To reveal the full method behind his deception is another. A premature accusation would allow certain details to remain unexplained, and that, as you must know, is a most unsatisfactory conclusion. Professor Langley, who had been standing near the window, turned. "And you are quite certain that the case is solved?" "Beyond any doubt," Holmes replied smoothly. Eleanor Ashworth, who had been uncharacteristically silent, folded her arms. "And the stolen mask? Have you recovered it?" Holmes regarded her with amusement. "Let us say that it is no longer quite so lost as it once appeared." A murmur of astonishment passed through the assembled household. Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, sir, but if you know who took it, should they not be arrested immediately?" Holmes rose, dusting off his coat. "Ah, Mr. Grayson, you misunderstand. The purpose of a thief is to avoid detection. But what happens when the thief realizes that they have already been caught?" Ashworth frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes's gaze swept over them all. "I mean, my dear lord, that the guilty party now finds themselves in a most uncomfortable position. For they know that come noon tomorrow, their secret will be laid bare." A silence fell over the room, thick with uncertainty. Then Holmes clapped his hands together. "Now, if you will excuse me, Watson and I have matters to attend to. The final act of our little drama is about to begin." With that, he strode from the room, leaving behind a house filled with unease, anticipation, and, most of all, fear. That night, as the household slumbered, Holmes and I took our positions in the darkened gallery. The grand hall, stripped of its daily light and activity, had an eerie stillness about it. The moon cast long shadows through the tall windows, and the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the manor was the only sound that accompanied us. Holmes, crouched beside the display case where the mask had once rested, murmured, "Watch carefully, Watson. The true nature of our adversary will reveal itself before dawn." I shifted slightly, peering into the gloom. "And you are certain that the thief will return?" "Not merely certain. Inevitable," he whispered. "They know their time is running out, and in desperation, even the most cunning minds make mistakes." The hours passed in silence, each moment stretching longer than the last. My senses, sharpened by the tension, caught every creak of the floorboards, every distant sigh of the wind against the manor walls. Then, just past midnight, it came. A faint movement, a shadow shifting where no shadow should be. Holmes did not move, nor did he signal to me. But I saw it too. Someone had entered the gallery. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. A dark figure glided along the edge of the room, pausing before the grand fireplace. I held my breath. Holmes, beside me, remained utterly still. Then, as the figure reached the far end of the gallery, Holmes moved like a striking viper. "Hold it right there," he commanded, his voice sharp as steel. A gasp. Then silence. The trap had been sprung. For several tense moments, Holmes and I remained perfectly still, our breathing shallow as we observed the figure gliding noiselessly through the gallery. The darkness concealed much of their form, but their movements were cautious, deliberate. They were searching for something. Holmes exhaled softly. "There, Watson. Observe." The figure paused near the farthest end of the room, where the heavy tapestries draped against the wall. A slender hand reached forward, brushing against the embroidered fabric. Then, with great care, the figure slipped behind it. In that instant, the moonlight fell upon them, just enough to dispel any lingering doubt. "Miss Eleanor Ashworth," Holmes murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "How very unsurprising." I stiffened. But what could she possibly be doing here? "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we are about to find out. With a sudden and decisive movement, Holmes stepped forward. "I would advise you not to move, Miss Ashworth," he called, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. A sharp intake of breath met his words. Eleanor froze, half concealed by the tapestry. For a moment, she seemed poised to flee, but Holmes advanced, his presence commanding and unyielding. "Step forward," he ordered, slowly. With evident reluctance, she emerged, her face shadowed but her posture defiant. "Mr. Holmes," she said calmly, "I had not expected to see you here." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet, here we both are, Miss Ashworth. The question is, why?" Her lips pressed together, and for the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered across her face. Then she lifted her chin. "I suppose," she said, "that I owe you an explanation." Holmes smiled. "Indeed you do. But first, let us see what it is you were so eager to recover." Holmes extended a hand toward the tapestry. "Shall I? Or would you prefer to do the honors?" Eleanor hesitated. Then, with visible resignation, she reached forward and drew the fabric aside. Behind it, nestled within a shallow recess in the wall, lay a small wooden compartment, its lid slightly ajar. I stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder. "A hidden compartment?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely, Watson. A rather elegant one, I might add. No doubt a relic of the Manor's more secretive past." He turned to Eleanor. "And yet, I suspect that is not what brought you here tonight." She exhaled slowly. "No, Mr. Holmes. I was searching for something else, something my grandfather once mentioned." Holmes regarded her with keen interest. "And that would be?" She hesitated. "A second artifact." A flicker of something, satisfaction perhaps, crossed Holmes's face. "Ah, now we are coming to it. You did not steal the mask, but you believed this compartment held something of equal value." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "I had no intention of taking anything. I only wanted to know the truth." Holmes studied her, then turned back to the compartment. With a swift motion, he pulled the lid fully open. The space within was empty, save for a fine layer of dust and a faint indentation where something had once rested. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." Eleanor's expression tightened. "Then I was right. Something was hidden here." Holmes straightened. "Yes, Miss Ashworth. But the more pertinent question is, who took it before you could?" Eleanor Ashworth remained by the hidden compartment, her hands clenched at her sides, her breath measured but taut with emotion. Holmes, ever watchful, regarded her with that piercing scrutiny of his, the faintest glimmer of amusement in his expression. "You search for something, Miss Ashworth," he said, "but not the mask." She hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded. "Yes. My grandfather once spoke of a secret chamber within the manor, one that held an artifact of great importance. He never told me what it was, only that it must never fall into the wrong hands." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "And yet, here you are, in the dead of night, attempting to recover it." "I wanted to know if it was real," she said quietly. "If it had been taken." Holmes gave a small nod of satisfaction. "And now you have your answer." He gestured to the dust-lined compartment. "Something was here, something valuable enough to be removed before you could find it." Eleanor's gaze darkened. "Then I was right to search." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Perhaps. But the question remains. Who took it? And why?" Eleanor swallowed, then looked him in the eye. "Mr. Holmes, I swear to you, I had nothing to do with the stolen mask." Holmes smiled. "That, Miss Ashworth, I already know." He turned sharply. Watson, come. It is time to retrieve what was truly stolen. Holmes strode through the dim corridors of Ashworth Manor, his steps swift and certain. I hurried after him, my mind whirling. Holmes, where are we going? To where the mask has been hidden all along, he replied. A most ingenious deception, Watson. A theft that was not a theft at all. He led us directly to Langley's study, where the historian's desk sat in pristine order. Holmes approached it without hesitation and picked up the half-burnt candle that had caught his attention before. Observe, Watson, he said, holding it up to the light. A peculiar composition, wax infused with a most unusual residue, and here, at its base, a small indentation. He pressed his fingers against the softened wax and, with a swift motion, broke it apart. A glint of gold flashed in the lamplight. Lord Ashworth gasped. The mask! Indeed, nestled within the thick wax of the candle was the missing artifact, buried in plain sight, hidden within a wax-coated duplicate. Holmes turned, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. A clever trick, he mused. By crafting a wax replica and melting the original into it, the mask remained within the very room it was stolen from, waiting to be extracted at the opportune moment. Langley, who had entered silently, turned deathly pale. Holmes smiled. Ah, Professor, I was wondering when you would arrive. Professor Langley's mouth opened, then closed again, his composure crumbling beneath Holmes's unwavering gaze. This is absurd, he said weakly. Holmes set the golden mask upon the desk with a decisive motion. Not at all. You crafted a replica in wax, allowing you to conceal the original within it. Over time, the heat of the candle melted away the outer layer, making it appear as though the theft had occurred much later than it truly had. Langley's fingers twitched. You have no proof. Holmes cut him off with a wave of his hand. Come now, Professor. The gold dust near the display case was residue from when you handled the mask too hastily. The candle itself contained traces of its metallic composition. And your unease during our conversation. It was not the questions that troubled you, but rather the knowledge that I was growing too close to the truth. Langley staggered back, his face ashen. Holmes turned to Lord Ashworth. I believe you may wish to summon the authorities, my lord. Our mystery has reached its inevitable conclusion. And with that, the great detective dusted his hands, as though wiping away the final traces of an illusion now laid bare. Professor Langley's breath came shallow and uneven as Holmes turned to face the assembled company. Lord Ashworth, his face still lined with disbelief, stood rigid by the desk, while Eleanor Ashworth remained slightly apart, her keen gaze fixed on Holmes. Mr. Grayson, the butler, looked between them all, his confusion plain. Now that we have recovered the mask, it remains only to explain how it was stolen. Or rather, how it was never stolen at all, Holmes said. He clasped his hands behind his back, his voice taking on that measured, deliberate cadence that I knew so well. The brilliance of this crime lay in its very impossibility. A theft from a locked gallery with no signs of forced entry, no disturbance, and no practical means of removing the artifact. But, as I've often remarked, Watson, once the impossible is eliminated, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. He turned to Langley. Professor, when you first examined the mask on the night before its supposed disappearance, you were alone, were you not? Langley's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Holmes nodded. Indeed, you had ample time to make your substitution. You created a wax duplicate of the mask, infused with just enough gold dust to maintain its luster. Then, with great care, you concealed the real artifact within a specially prepared candle and placed it upon your desk, knowing that in time, the heat would cause the wax to melt away, leaving behind an empty husk. By morning, when the theft was discovered, your deception was complete. A murmur of astonishment swept through the room. Lord Ashworth shook his head. But why, Holmes? Why go to such elaborate lengths? Holmes gestured toward Langley. Professor Langley is a scholar, not a common thief. He did not wish to sell the mask, he wished to study it. Had he simply stolen it outright, suspicion would have fallen upon him at once. But by fabricating this mystery, he hoped to buy himself enough time to examine the mask in secret before discreetly returning it. Langley sagged against the desk, defeated. But Holmes, I interjected, how did you first suspect the truth? Holmes smiled. Ah, Watson, that brings us to the gold dust. Holmes turned back to the display case, running his fingers lightly along its surface. The first indication that something was amiss was the presence of gold dust. I frowned, but surely that would be expected. The mask was golden after all. Precisely, Watson, Holmes said. And yet consider this. Had the mask been stolen in the manner suggested, where would we expect to find traces of dust? I thought for a moment. On the floor, perhaps, or on the hands of the thief. Holmes nodded. Quite so. And yet, the only gold dust I found was in a neat concentrated patch near the pedestal. That suggested that the mask had not been snatched in haste, but rather handled with care and precision. Someone had spent time with it, more time than a thief would dare risk. Lord Ashworth's eyes widened. Langley, Holmes inclined his head. Indeed, Langley, as the last man to examine the artifact, was the only person who could have made the substitution without arousing immediate suspicion. But that was not enough to prove his guilt. I needed something more. He tapped the candle upon Langley's desk. And that is where this peculiar object became of interest. Holmes lifted the half-melted candle once more, turning it so the light caught the last remnants of golden wax clinging to its surface. This, gentlemen, was our thief's true hiding place. Eleanor leaned forward, her brow furrowed. You mean the mask was inside the candle all along? Precisely, Holmes replied. The candle was carefully crafted to conceal the artifact within a hollow chamber. The wax coating, infused with a trace of gold, gave the illusion of an ordinary candle. As the days passed, the heat melted away the outer layer, slowly revealing the mask beneath. I shook my head in amazement. A deception of patience rather than cunning. Holmes smiled. Quite so, Watson. Langley knew that the greatest trick was to make the theft appear as though it had happened long after it truly had. By the time the mask was discovered missing, the wax had melted away, leaving no trace of its prior concealment. Lord Ashworth exhaled heavily. A brilliant deception. Holmes gave a slight bow. But, like all deceptions, doomed to failure under sufficient scrutiny. Langley, his face ashen, remained silent. The case was closed. Holmes turned toward Mr. Grayson, the butler, who still looked troubled. You mentioned hearing noises in the gallery at night. Footsteps, faint whispers, the occasional metallic scrape. Grayson nodded. Yes, sir. More than once. Holmes gave a satisfied smile. That, my good fellow, was our culprit at work. Lord Ashworth frowned. You mean Langley? Precisely, Holmes said. The professor needed to ensure that his deception remained undetected until the right moment. Each night, he checked the wax replica, gauging how much had melted, making certain that no one had noticed the change. That was the metallic scraping you heard, the shifting of the display case, or the subtle movement of his tools. Grayson exhaled. "I thought it was my imagination, sir." "On the contrary," Holmes said. "You were an unwitting witness to the most crucial phase of the crime. Langley had to be careful. Had the wax melted too quickly, the deception would have been discovered before he was ready. Had it taken too long, he risked the case being locked permanently before he could retrieve the real mask." Holmes turned to Langley. "An intricate plan, Professor, but no deception can hold forever." Langley, pale and silent, said nothing. Lord Ashworth gestured toward his desk, where the ominous letter still lay. "And what of this, Mr. Holmes? The warning to return the mask to Egypt?" Holmes picked up the parchment and examined it once more. "A clever ruse," he said, "but nothing more than a distraction." Eleanor's eyes widened. "You mean it was a forgery?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed. Had the letter arrived days after the theft, it might have seemed an accusation, but it was placed in your study before the mask was even reported missing. That is what made it suspicious. It was Langley's attempt to shift the blame onto an external force, to make it seem as if the theft were an act of retribution rather than greed." I rubbed my chin. So, Langley hoped that suspicion would fall upon those who had a rightful claim to the artifact. "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said. "Had we not uncovered the truth, the mystery would have lingered, with whispers of international intrigue and stolen heritage clouding the simple fact that this was a crime of opportunity." He cast a glance at Langley. "A desperate man will seize any means to mislead those who pursue him." Langley let out a long breath, the weight of his failed deception settling upon him. "You understand nothing, Holmes." "On the contrary," Holmes said, "I understand everything." He paced slowly. "You never intended to keep the mask indefinitely, Professor. You are not a common thief, nor would you have risked selling it in a public auction. No, you had something far more insidious in mind." Holmes turned to Lord Ashworth. Langley's knowledge of antiquities meant he had access to a network of private collectors, men who would pay fortunes for an artifact such as this, no questions asked. Langley's hands curled into fists. "It does not belong in a museum. It belongs at the hands of those who truly appreciate its worth." Holmes smiled coldly. "And by those, you mean a discreet buyer, willing to pay a king's ransom for an object that would never see the light of day again." Lord Ashworth's expression darkened. "You would have tarnished my family's name for personal gain?" Langley did not respond. He knew as well as we did that the game was lost. Holmes turned away. "Greed, Watson, a motive as old as time." Eleanor Ashworth, who had remained silent through much of the exchange, now stepped forward. "And what of me, Mr. Holmes? You doubted me from the beginning." Holmes studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "I never doubted you, Miss Ashworth. I merely observed." She frowned. "Then you knew I was not involved?" "Of course," Holmes said. "You were searching for something entirely different. You were looking for the secret your grandfather spoke of, a hidden compartment within the manor." Her breath caught. "So it was real." Holmes nodded. "Yes, but whatever lay inside was removed long ago." He gave her a pointed glance. "You sought knowledge, not theft. That is the difference between you and Professor Langley." Eleanor exhaled, relief and frustration mingling in her expression. "I only wish I had found the truth sooner." Holmes inclined his head. "As do we all, Miss Ashworth." The arrival of the authorities was a quiet but inevitable affair. Langley, his features drained of defiance, was led away without protest. Lord Ashworth turned to Holmes. "My debt to you is immeasurable, Mr. Holmes. The mask will be donated as promised, its rightful place secured." Holmes inclined his head. "A wise decision, my lord. Some treasures are best admired by all." As we departed the manor, I could not help but feel the weight of all that had transpired. But Holmes, as always, was already one step ahead. "Come, Watson," he said. "There is still the matter of a final answer." As the train carried us back to London, I turned to Holmes. "Did you ever doubt your deductions?" Holmes gazed out at the passing countryside, a faint smile upon his lips. "Every mystery is but a puzzle of shadows and light, my dear Watson, and I have always been fond of the light." I shook my head, amused. "One day, Holmes, you will give me a straight answer." He chuckled. "Perhaps, Watson, but where would be the fun in that?" And with that, he returned to his silent contemplation, while I sat back, content in the knowledge that yet another case had been solved. The rhythmic clatter of the train carried us back to London, the case now neatly resolved. I sat opposite Holmes, watching as he stared absently out of the window, his fingers lightly drumming against the armrest. Though the mystery had been unravelled, I could see that his mind still turned over the finer details, seeking perfection even in resolution. I cleared my throat. "Holmes, I must ask, what do you think was Langley's greatest miscalculation?" Holmes glanced at me with a faint smile. "Ah, Watson, therein lies the irony of deception. He believed that an illusion, carefully constructed, would stand against cold logic. He accounted for human error, but not for the inevitability of discovery. The simplest clues, a trace of gold dust, a half-burnt candle, were enough to undo his grand design." I nodded. "So, no crime, no matter how intricate, is ever truly flawless." Holmes exhaled softly. "A thief may deceive the eyes of men, but not the weight of truth. The truth is relentless, Watson. It does not dissolve like wax nor vanish like shadows. It waits, patient and unyielding for those who care to see it." I leaned back, considering his words. Outside, London loomed on the horizon, a city of secrets and stories yet to be told. Now, dear reader, the mystery is yours to ponder. What do you believe was Langley's greatest mistake? Was it the gold dust, the wax-coated deception, or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below, and if you enjoy unravelling Sherlock Holmes's most perplexing cases, be sure to subscribe for more mysteries like this story, and share it with fellow lovers of classic detective fiction. The game, as always, is afoot.